Greetings, comrades. We continue discussing the program of the Zimbabwe Communist Party, completing the liberation of Zimbabwe. We are discussing the economic structural adjustment program as adopted in 1991. We said we are breaking this subject into two videos. We note in our program that there was a sharp decline in average real wages. By the mid-1990s, average real earnings fell to the lowest level since the early 1970s. ESAP was quickly bringing much of the Zimbabwean working class into poverty. In the rural areas, the majority of the population was often forced to depend on food aid. I'm sure those that were in Zimbabwe then will also remember that in 1992 we're using yellow meal. We used to call it in Kenya, which was being distributed by government. As we pointed out last time, that the return of the rains in 1993 did not improve the situation substantially, making it clear that the Economic Structural Adjustment Program reforms themselves were the leading factor in undermining ordinary people's living standards. Loan agreements emanating from ESAP stretched the country's foreign and domestic debt to unmanageable proportions. Remember that the reason why we actually went to the IMF and the World Bank is that in the first decade of the majority rule, we were unable now to pay the debt, and then we said in the previous video that it was expected that ESAP, the loan from the World Bank, was going to be $3 million US. But here we note that the debt continued to grow even during ESAP. ESAP's deficit cutting fetish has led to the status slashing of real per capita social spending throughout the 1990s, and the marked undermining of local industry by government's greater role in one part of the private sector and the financial markets. Forced to borrow heavily from the local markets to finance reforms and service the deficit, government ended up distorting financial flows. Heavy public sector demand crowded out private sector borrowing, and they kept real interest rates punishingly high. And of course, during this time, the middle class had to import goods from outside. We saw shops, particularly in Harare, Bulawayo, and in major cities that now were selling luxury items that were imported from outside. And as imports were overtaking exports, the value of the Zim dollar rapidly declined on the money market. And as the appetite for imported goods grew from the better off, the rate on inflation increased rapidly. It was at this time again that we were introduced to what we call a shiny disease. The shiny disease is the idea that we must have the latest shiny technology, whether or not it is appropriate for our specific needs. For instance, you will know that our roads are not up to standard. Roads that link our districts. You will have better roads that link big cities, but the roads that link our districts are in bad shape. But that has never stopped the government to buy for ministers and government officials vehicles that are not meant for our own roads. That is the Mercedes-Benz. Because a minister or a government official want to be seen being chauffeur-driven in a Mercedes-Benz as opposed to the normal 4x4. And again, this shiny disease was experienced also or emerged during the late 1980s when the National Railways of Zimbabwe, NRZ, decided to exchange steam locomotives made in Zimbabwe and a burning coal mined in Zimbabwe with the diesel locomotives made in Canada, running on expensive imported diesel supply because it seemed more modern. You will recall that President Mnangagwa has gone back to unveil the old locomotives that we're using. So it was not necessary at the time to abandon the steam locomotives in favor of the diesel locomotives, which were to import from Canada. The parts were to come from Canada if were to repair. So the basic reason for all the inflation was the utter failure to understand what an economy is really about and to allow all the ideology of neoliberalism and its practical expression, monetarism. You remember we said that our majority rule occurred at a time when Margaret Thatcher had become the Prime Minister in Britain in 1979 and Ronald Reagan, who were advancing this ideology of neoliberalism. It was during this period that the ZANU-PF leadership, having abandoned completely not only Marxism-Leninism, but also the leadership code, really began to be perceived by the majority of Zimbabweans as a separate class from the rest. There was this class that then emerged, and this class was called the chefs. So they wanted to be addressed as chefs. They were the political leadership. They were controlling everything. They had access to foreign currency. They had access to everything. Really removed from the majority. They became a separate class on their own. But it was at the time that when inflation was shooting up and the wages were declining, that within the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Union, ZCTU, an idea was developed of leaving the alliance with the ZANU-PF and creating a mass party, a mass working party based on the lines of the British Labour Party. You'll recall that we previously said that ZCTU was founded in 1981 with the brother of the late Mugabe, Albert Mugabe, becoming its first Secretary General. It was considered an organ of ZANU-PF at the time when it was created. But when there were these differences, ideological differences, when the ZANU-PF-led government introduced the ESAP, the ZCTU began to fight for its independence and began to talk about establishing a working class mass movement. It was expected, of course, which we'll later analyze, that the new party was going to oppose the economic structural adjustment program and the neoliberal agenda being pushed by the USA and Britain through the IMF and the World Bank. But of course, we will discuss later the hijacking of the working class movement, as was the case with the liberation movement. So this brings us to conclude on the discussion of the economic structural adjustment program. As we said, that we are not covering this in detail, but we will want to focus on the land question briefly in our next discussion, so that we understand the land question, what happened, and so forth, so that we then move forward to look into what we call the plan for Zimbabwe. Please continue writing your views. Let us engage. Like the video, subscribe. Thank you so much. Amandla, comrades.